Good morning, everyone. Here is this week's quick video for you going down the path of what it means to do restorative discipline. I want to start by reading the epitaph of one of my favorite books of poetry, which is by a guy named Young Pueblo, and it's called Inward. And this is literally just the epitaph. Two of the great lessons humanity will learn in the 21st century will be: to harm another is to harm oneself. When you heal yourself, you heal the world. So I use that to sort of frame, why do we do restorative discipline? Why do we do restorative relationships? It's essentially for healing the woes between people, for healing the woes that we experience with ourselves, and for healing the woes between us and the world. You can sort of think about that like this sort of essential conflicts that show up in literature, right? We're trying to heal man versus self, man versus other, man versus world, man versus nature. So restoring is across the board a reciprocal kind of endeavor. Where we are right now, I talked last time about respect, the importance of respect, and then sort of navigating anger within the process of conflict resolution, which I think requires some revisiting also. But where we are is the importance of relationships and the restorative model. When we think about discipline, when we think about what we want out of our classroom and what we want with each other, it's to uphold the relationship and the importance of building strong relationships across the board. This gets to the core value that PTech defined of trust. So relationships, when we have strong relationships based in respect, we also have trust. We build an environment in which people feel safe. And to keep the relationship central in conflict or in restorative discipline, we need to do something that my mentor described to me as emotional judo. So in other words, to keep the relationship center to the conflict, we focus on hearing both sides. We focus on hearing all the voices that are involved. And when I talk about upholding dignity, I mean that we're not there to tear down, we're there to build up. And when in upholding dignity, when one feels wronged, when one feels really, really angry and really, really determined to sit in that anger, is difficult. So this is where, as mediators, as teachers, or as counselors, we guide the process, where we come in and try to help the students stay in the language of I. I felt this way when you did this. It disrupted the relationship because what I need is trust, or what I need is to feel safe. So when we allow relationships to be center in conflict, then what happens is the students involved or the teachers involved all get to tell their side of the story, their perspective. And we uphold that perspective not as one being more right or more wrong than the other, but as both having equal value. And what we may learn when we uphold the relationship is that there's a similarity between what students and teachers might be going through. So when a student is able to hear that the other student is going through something that is difficult, maybe a grandmother passed away, maybe a best friend betrayed them, maybe they just broke up with someone, then what we have then is empathy. So when we can hear, this is going on for me and this is where I was coming from, not only does it build respect, not only does it facilitate restoration, but it also builds trust and empathy, as I said. When we can relate to the human issues, when we can relate to what's going on in someone's life and trying to understand behavior from that perspective, the conflict becomes much more relatable. The conflict becomes much more of a tangible thing that we can see in our own lives, as opposed to something that's abstract or out there. The other part that happens is that when we can get to empathy or keeping the relationship central, the relationships actually become stronger. I've heard this example used with little boys, and I have little boys, is that when little boys who tend to be really, let's say, physical oriented in their bodies and really I want to say justice oriented, when they can have it out with each other, when they can sort of build trust in a way, they become closer. We've heard the proverbial story of like, these two little boys got in a fight on the playground and now they're best friends. I don't advocate for the fight on the playground because we're trying to avoid that. But what we are trying to do is to see how conflict can sometimes actually build stronger relationships. I know, for example, in my own relationship, when we can navigate conflict safely, when we can navigate conflict respectfully, there's actually a closeness that grows from that. So what I want you to think about as a teacher is, what is your relationship to the students that you work with? Do you know them by name? Do you know something about their life circumstances? Are the check-in questions that you're asking of them when you do circles or when you do a brief check-in at the beginning of the class, are they building relationship or are they sort of passive in relationship? What's your favorite color is a somewhat passive relationship builder, but what was something that brought you joy this week is a more active relationship builder, because then we start to learn how other students see the world. And when we can start to ask questions like that and check in, then we know then a little bit more about where the student is coming from. One of my favorite thinkers and activists and kind of change makers in the world is Bryan Stevenson. He started the Equal Justice Initiative and has facilitated the building and implementation of the Peace and Justice Memorial in Montgomery, Alabama. It is, if you haven't seen it, the installation of dozens and dozens and dozens of steel columns hanging from a structure that represent bodies that have been lynched over time and represent the black bodies that have been traumatized, tortured, and killed by white supremacy. And his whole purpose in life is to re-educate and to reorient our culture to a restorative, reconciliatory model. And he believes that part of that is in telling the truth. So we need to tell the truth about our experience. We need to build relationships that make truth-telling possible so that we can restore and reconcile ourselves to one another. But what he says is, everyone is better than the worst thing they've done. Everyone is better than the worst thing they've done. So what I want you to ask yourselves is, do you believe that? Not just about yourself, but about the students that you work with. Where does mercy show up in your teaching and in the relationships that you're building? Do you have a lens toward your students that is forgiving, understanding, and empathetic? Or does it tend to be blaming, aggressive, and pigeonholing? When we can widen the view that we see people through, widen the lens, they become more understandable to us. I want to be very clear that, again, I introduced this when I introduced the restorative model. Restoration does not lack responsibility. Taking personal responsibility is incredibly important in the restorative process. But we can get there more easily when we have a foundational view that everyone is better than the worst thing they've done, that every human being is worthy of dignity, respect, and love. Every single one of us has made a regrettable decision, has done a regrettable behavior. And in any one of those moments, we've either had someone come alongside us and help us reorient, or someone come alongside us and help us dig further in to our resentment, anger, and this feeling that it's us against the world. So I think one of the things that we want to lessen is this feeling of us against the world, and increase the amount of trust. Again, it gets back to this core value that PTech has identified of trust. Building trusting communities is rooted in relationship. It is not about the adult saying, I know what I'm talking about up here, you need to just believe me. It's about the adult saying, I believe in relationship, trust, and empathy Here's why, and let me show you. So it's where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. It's where what we think about education and what we think about why we're doing this meets our actions and our behaviors. There's this saying in Buddhism that says thoughts become things. And that couldn't be more true here. How we think about our children, how we think about our students, how we think about someone's worthiness to be forgiven and to be restored to the community is going to dictate our behavior. Again, keeping relationships central, wanting a world where two people, no matter how different, can thrive inside of a conflict is imperative. Conflict builds healthier relationships when it is done well. Keeping that in mind will help us move forward. So your sort of contemplation question that I would ask you is, what is your relationship to self in the world? Do you have a relationship to yourself where you feel dignified, seen, and heard? And I know that our society does not make that available to everyone. We all have different sort of embodied experiences. I, as a white middle-class woman, have a different experience than an immigrant Latino girl, right? So my embodiment is going to be different. So that's why it's important to ask, what is our relationship to the world? Do we feel seen? And then what is our relationship to those who are in our closest circle? Do we feel like we have healthy conflict? Because when we can start with our relationship to self as being one that is more dignified and uplifting, then we're going to do that with other relationships in our lives. My mentor always says that how we do one thing is how we do everything. How your relationship to yourself begins is going to dictate how your relationship to others evolves. So that's your contemplation question for the week. I really hope you guys have a good Monday and a good rest of your week, and I will look forward to hearing from you guys soon.